It began with a sentence so careless yet so revealing that it shook South Africa's political conversation. President Cyril Ramaphosa stood before his nation and compared what he calls the ANC monologue to Cordessa and even to the Freedom Charter. For millions of South Africans, this was not just ridiculous, it was insulting. Cordessa was born in fire in real struggle when ordinary men and women risked their lives to overthrow apartheid. The Freedom Charter was not a staged event, it was a cry of blood and sacrifice. And yet today, Ramaphosa dares to place his hollow dialogue beside those sacred milestones. This is not just about one speech, it is about what happens when a ruling party that once commanded 70% of the vote now claims to barely 40% and still refuses to let go. It is about a president who tries to rebuild power, not through parliament, not through the constitution, but through a stage-managed performance designed to steal the hearts of the people he has already lost at the ballot box. But here is the contrast that Africa itself cannot ignore. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré does not hide behind artificial dialogues. He does not pretend that sovereignty can be manufactured in a hotel hall. Instead, he meets his people directly, anchoring his leadership on truth, action, and accountability. One leader seeks legitimacy by inflating numbers, the other by facing reality. So I ask you, is Ramaphosa protecting democracy, or is he quietly overthrowing it under the name of dialogue? If votes can be ignored, if a 40% result can be twisted into 72% of power, what does democracy even mean? Friends, stay with me, because in the next few minutes we will expose how this ANC monologue is not a harmless meeting. It is a rebellion against your vote, and before this video ends, I will show you exactly what we as citizens can do. If you believe South Africa must rise instead of whimper press, share this story and let us begin. The fall of a giant rarely comes with thunder. More often it arrives quietly in percentages that slip downward year after year until the once mighty colossus is revealed as hollow. South Africa's African National Congress, the Liberation Party that once commanded the world's admiration, has been on that path for 2 decades. Do you remember when Jacob Zuma celebrated victory with a wide grin, boasting that no one can defeat us if we are with the people? At that time, the ANC commanded nearly 70% of the vote. It seemed untouchable, permanent, a fixture in South Africa's democracy. And yet, election after election, the numbers began to tell another story. From 70% to 60% to 61%. Slowly, steadily, the great machine of liberation began to rust. By 2024, the decline could no longer be disguised. For the first time in living memory, the ANC collapsed to 40%. The symbolism was breathtaking. A century-old party once synonymous with the struggle against apartheid had become a shadow of itself. The people had spoken. Change was no longer a whisper, it was a demand. But here is the cruel irony. Instead of bowing to the democratic verdict, Ramaphosa and his circle tried to rewrite it. They launched what they call the ANC monologue, dressing it in the robes of national dialogue. He compared it to Cordessa, to the Freedom Charter, even to the birth of South Africa's constitution. But the truth is painful. This was not a dialogue of equals, nor a moment of national rebirth. It was an attempt to undo the judgment of the ballot box. And what makes this betrayal so bitter is the contrast with Africa's rising voices. Look north to Burkina Faso. President Ibrahim Traoré has faced moments just as tense, moments where legitimacy was questioned, where the people demanded clarity. But instead of creating staged conferences, Traoré has chosen direct accountability. He does not hide behind committees or hollow speeches. He walks the streets, commands reforms, and places sovereignty above political theater. That is why, even when controversial, he is seen as genuine. Meanwhile, in South Africa, Ramaphosa's performance feels like the opposite. The ANC monologue gathered foundations, civic groups, even some unions, but quickly lost legitimacy. One by one, the Democratic Alliance, the Economic Freedom Fighters Action (SAMK), the Freedom Front all pulled out. Even the heavyweights of civil society withdrew. What was left was not a dialogue, it was a stage play, a theater where Ramaphosa stood alone pretending to listen, while the real institutions of governance, parliament, cabinet, judiciary, were nowhere to be found. The symbolism could not be clearer. Parliament had said, "You earned 40%. Ramaphosa replied, "No, I am 72%. Parliament had demanded accountability. Ramaphosa offered spectacle. And while the ANC supporters clapped politely, the country at large saw something else, the quiet death of democratic practice, not with a bang, but with a whimper. This then is the heart of the crisis. The ANC's decline is not just about losing votes, it is about what happens when a ruling party so used to power cannot imagine life without it. It is about the lengths to which it will go to reinvent its authority, even at the cost of the constitution itself, and that is why this moment matters, not just for South Africa, but for Africa, because across the continent, new models of leadership are emerging, some flawed, some inspiring. The question is, which model will South Africa choose? Will it be the staged monologue of a tired elite, or the direct accountability demanded by a younger generation, the kind of accountability symbolized today by leaders like Ibrahim Traoré? The so-called ANC monologue reached its peak not in unity, but in chaos. Inside the hall, the atmosphere turned raw, unfiltered. Citizens, activists, and civic leaders who had been invited began to realize what was unfolding. This was not dialogue, it was theater, and as the microphones passed from one hand to another, the voices grew louder, sharper, angrier. "Stop talking down on us," one participant shouted. Another stood and cried, "Nothing for us without us." The session descended into open confrontation. Instead of calm problem-solving, the room echoed with frustration and betrayal. What was supposed to be national healing had become national shouting. Ramaphosa's comparison of this noisy gathering to Cordesa and the Freedom Charter only fueled the anger. Cordesa was the moment the apartheid regime met the liberation movement to negotiate a new order. The Freedom Charter was written with the blood and sweat of people who dreamed of justice. But here was a president stripped of legitimacy, trying to cloak his 40% defeat with the garments of history. To many, it felt like blasphemy against the very struggle that birthed South Africa's democracy. The reaction was not only from the floor. Major political parties had already walked away. The Democratic Alliance dismissed the process as unconstitutional. The economic freedom fighters labeled it a farce. Action SA and MK accused Ramaphosa of attempting to create a parallel parliament. Even foundations and civic groups that once sympathized with the ANC refused to remain part of what they saw as a stage-managed charade. By the time the monologue went live, it had already lost its most credible voices, and yet Ramaphosa pressed on, like Absalom in the ancient story, standing at the gates whispering to the people, "Come to me, I will give you justice." He sought to steal the hearts of the nation away from their legitimate representatives. The parallel was chilling. In the Bible, Absalom's rebellion ended in civil strife. In South Africa, critics fear the same seeds are being sown: distrust in parliament, erosion of constitutional order, and the rise of one man's performance politics over the rule of law. Observers were stunned at how brazen the attempt was. Parliament was absent, cabinet was absent, the judiciary was absent. Even the government of national unity, the coalition that should have been the very center of governance, was nowhere to be seen. All that remained was a president speaking to a hall of restless voices, pretending to orchestrate a nation. It was at this moment that comparisons with the rest of Africa became unavoidable. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré has also faced moments of upheaval, but his approach has been radically different. Rather than creating a show of dialogue, Traoré has chosen to confront hard realities, nationalizing gold mines, building housing projects, and reshaping institutions. Whether one agrees or not, his actions are concrete, not theatrical. His authority comes not from a staged audience, but from decisions felt in the lives of ordinary people. This is why the ANC monologue hits such a nerve. South Africans looked at the shouting hall and saw emptiness. They looked abroad and saw leaders, even in fragile states, daring to make bold choices. The contrast was too stark to ignore. For the people inside that room, the climax came when one participant, exasperated, raised their voice above the din. "You don't decide for us. Spend more time listening to us than telling us what to do." The cry captured the essence of the day. It was not just anger at Ramaphosa. It was a lament for what South Africa's democracy was supposed to be, a place where the people's voice mattered, not where their votes were rewritten in the language of false revolutions. The fallout was immediate. Media outlets highlighted the chaos. Analysts described the dialogue as a rebellion against the voter. Citizens outside the hall shook their heads in disbelief. "We voted for change," one man said on the street, "and they gave us this circus." In that moment, the ANC monologue became a symbol of something larger, the desperation of a ruling party that had lost its majority, yet refused to lose its grip. The crescendo was not applause, but disillusionment, not unity, but fragmentation. And as the dust settled, one truth remained: South Africa had reached a breaking point. When the noise of the ANC monologue finally faded, the consequences became clear. What had been dressed as a national dialogue left behind not unity, but fractures. For ordinary South Africans, it was another sign that the political elite were no longer listening. For the country's institutions, it was proof of how fragile the democratic order had become. The first consequence was the sidelining of Parliament. According to South Africa's constitution, Parliament is where national dialogue belongs. It is where parties debate, where the people's representatives hold the executive to account. But in this case, Parliament was ignored. Instead of addressing lawmakers, Ramaphosa built a parallel stage. He spoke not in the chamber, but in a hall filled with hand-picked voices. For many, this was nothing short of unconstitutional, a bypass of the very body meant to anchor the republic. The second consequence was the distortion of electoral legitimacy. The people had given the ANC 40% of the vote, a clear message that no single party should dominate. Yet Ramaphosa's cabinet appointments told a different story: 72% of seats filled by ANC loyalists. It was a mathematical sleight of hand that mocked the ballot box. To citizens, it felt like theft, not of money this time, but of their most sacred right, the vote. The third consequence rippled into society. Confidence in the system eroded. Citizens began asking a dangerous question: why vote at all? If election results can be manipulated after the fact, then democracy becomes a ritual without meaning. This loss of trust does not appear in headlines, but it eats away at the foundations of civic life. When the people stop believing in the power of their ballot, the path is opened for unrest, populism, or even authoritarian shortcuts. The fourth consequence was symbolic but profound. The ANC, once the global emblem of liberation, now stood accused of betraying the very principles it had once embodied. International observers noted the irony: a party born to fight apartheid now eroding the mechanisms of accountability. The shame of it weighed heavily on those who had once marched under its banners. And yet, while South Africa wrestled with disillusionment, comparisons abroad grew louder. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré's government has also faced criticism, but one thing is undeniable: his reforms are tangible. He nationalized gold, launched housing projects, banned exploitative contracts. Whether one agrees or disagrees with his policies, they are rooted in clear action. In contrast, Ramaphosa's monologue produced no law, no reform, no policy, only words. The contrast was devastating. For South Africans, the practical effects were felt almost immediately. Prices continued to rise, unemployment stayed high, corruption cases stalled, and yet instead of explaining solutions in Parliament, the president invested time and resources into a dialogue that many saw as hollow. Frustration boiled over not just in political circles, but in households where parents wondered how to feed their children while leaders played at politics. Civil society groups began to mobilize, filing petitions, demanding answers from the Speaker of Parliament. Our Parliament is supposed to be the people's voice, they argued, not a rubber stamp for the president's ambitions. But even here, memories of past failures lingered. Under Jacob Zuma, Parliament had already failed once to hold the executive accountable during the Mkandla scandal. Now, history seemed to be repeating itself. The social fabric frayed further. Young people, many of them first-time voters in 2024, spoke with bitterness. "We gave them our votes, they took our voices," one student said. The anger of the youth is no small matter in a country where more than half the population is under 30. When young citizens lose faith, the future of democracy itself is at risk. Thus, the ANC monologue left behind more than angry headlines. It left behind broken trust, a weakened parliament, and a cabinet that did not reflect the will of the people. It left behind a society unsure whether their vote mattered, and in a continent where other nations are experimenting with bold reforms, South Africa risked appearing as the outlier, a democracy in name but not in practice. The ripples of the ANC monologue did not stop at South Africa's borders. Around the world, analysts and policymakers took notice. For decades, the African National Congress was celebrated internationally as the moral giant of liberation politics. It was the party that helped dismantle apartheid, the party of Mandela, the beacon of justice in a divided world. But now, from Washington to Brussels, headlines spoke of an uncomfortable truth: the ANC was no longer the unstoppable force it once claimed to be. In the United States, where democracy itself has been tested in recent years, observers drew uneasy parallels. What happens when a president refuses to accept the limits of a vote? What happens when the institutions meant to check power, parliament, judiciary, civil society, are sidelined by the executive? For older Americans who lived through Watergate or who remember contested elections, the scenes from Johannesburg felt strangely familiar. They knew the dangers of silence. They knew how fragile democracy can become when leaders bend the rules to suit themselves. The Western media framed Ramaphosa's dialogue as a rebellion against the voter. European outlets asked whether South Africa was slipping into a post-democratic phase where elections continue in form but lose their substance. Diplomats whispered concerns about stability. Investors wondered aloud if South Africa's institutions still provided the checks and balances that protect a free economy. And then came the contrast. While South Africa struggled to justify a hollow dialogue, other African nations were charting new, if controversial, courses. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré stood as a vivid counterpoint. Instead of convening empty conferences, he was nationalizing resources, pushing reforms, and presenting himself not as a performer, but as a doer. For international audiences, the juxtaposition was striking: one leader inflating numbers and staging monologues, another insisting that sovereignty could only be proven through concrete action. For Washington, this raised uncomfortable questions. The U.S. has long partnered with South Africa as a stable democracy, a gateway to Africa. But if South Africa's institutions falter, does that role weaken? And if citizens across the continent see leaders like Traoré taking bold, visible steps, while South Africa offers only words, where will African loyalties drift? The question was no longer academic, it was strategic. For American viewers, especially those who believe in the sanctity of the ballot, the lesson is sobering. A vote means nothing if leaders can rewrite its outcome. Democracy survives not because leaders allow it, but because institutions and citizens defend it. And as South Africa's monologue unravels, it serves as a warning not just for Africa, but for every democracy. Silence is complicity. Democracy does not die in a single day. It does not collapse with the roar of tanks or the crash of parliament doors. More often it fades quietly, vote by vote, speech by speech, monologue by monologue, until the people wake up one morning to realize that their voice no longer matters. That is the warning South Africa faces today. The ANC monologue may appear harmless to some, just another political event, another speech, another gathering. But beneath the surface, it represents something far more dangerous: the attempt to replace the authority of the ballot box with the authority of a stage-managed performance. When a president takes 40% of the vote and inflates it into 72% of power, he is not governing, he is rebelling against the people. This is why history feels so heavy in this moment. The same ANC that once carried the torch of liberation is now accused of betraying its legacy, and the choice before South Africa is stark: accept the slow erosion of democracy or demand that institutions, parliament, and citizens themselves rise to defend the constitution. Across Africa, the winds are shifting. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré is redefining what leadership means, not by pretending to hold dialogues, but by taking concrete steps that directly affect his people. Whether one agrees or not, he has made accountability and sovereignty the measure of his authority. That contrast is not meant to shame South Africa, but to remind it that alternatives exist. Africa's future does not have to be written in whispers, it can be written in action. So the question now is for you, the citizens, the viewers, the elders who remembered Mandela's promise, and the young who cast their first ballot in 2024. Will South Africa rise, or will it whimper? Will you allow the monologue to replace your vote, or will you insist that your parliament do its duty and hold the president accountable? You have the power to answer. Please share this video if you believe citizens must defend their vote. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than political headlines. And leave your comment below. Do you think President Ramaphosa is safeguarding democracy or quietly undermining it? Should South Africa follow the path of staged dialogues or the path of sovereignty and accountability, like Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré? History will not remember the speeches. It will remember whether the people spoke back.